Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future. Today, we're going to be exploring a story that combines satellites, AI, and centuries-old trees. Arbonics, a fast-growing climate tech company, just launched in Sweden with an ambitious plan to unlock billions in carbon income for forest owners by helping them get paid to not cut down trees. They're doing this through the carbon markets, a system for putting a price on carbon, allowing companies to trade emissions allowances or buy credits to offset their carbon footprints. Nature-based solutions like forest conservation and reforestation are going to play a key role in capturing and storing carbon in natural ecosystems. Already valued at over 950 billion, it's a huge and growing market. Joining us today is Lisette Luik, co-founder of Arbonics, to talk about how data-driven forest management could shift the economics of land use, restore nature, and help reshape the future of the carbon markets in Europe. We'll get into the tech, the trade-offs, and the tough questions around trust, transparency, and impact. Forest carbon credits are currently a fairly contentious solution to the climate challenge because of questions around additionality, permanence, and leakage. There have been scandals around estimation and credit quality, even if a lot of those are due to methodologies used historically. But in the end, it all boils down to concerns about greenwash. So this is not just a story about trees, but actually about the future of nature-based solutions overall. Welcome to the show, Lisette.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
So I think the first thing to do is, could you explain exactly what Arbonics is doing? You know, how you got here and why you've expanded into Sweden?
Absolutely. So the core idea behind Arbonics is really two things. It's about bringing together two sides of the climate problem in nature. So on one side, you have landowners who want to manage their land in a climate forward way, but whose incentives historically have really pushed them towards just cut more trees because that's the only way they can make money. And then on the other side, you have companies who want to compensate for their footprint or want to just invest in nature, and they don't necessarily know how to do it. And they are really struggling with trust because historically, voluntary carbon projects have had perhaps reputational issues. And so at Arbonics, we're bringing those two sides together and bridging them using data and technology to make it easy for companies to support direct landowner action through planting new forests and keeping existing forests growing.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. One of the questions I have, though, is why Sweden? Why now? And one of the reasons I ask is, you know, I've heard that there's 29 billion potential in forest income, but the size of the current voluntary market is only 2 billion. So how's that going to work?
So why Sweden? I think we should take a step back where else we are today.
Okay.
We are a European-based company, and we're doing these both afforestation and other forest carbon projects in Europe, which is fairly unusual. They're usually done in African countries, Southeast Asia, etc. And the rationale we have for doing it in Europe is there's actually much better regulatory protections in Europe. So we work a lot with converting low-quality farmland, marginal pasture land into forest land. And once you plant, you legally convert the land. And then it becomes, under European regulatory environment, very difficult to deforest that land. Mm-hmm. That's not necessarily true in other parts of the world. You don't necessarily have that confidence. But this is why we are in Europe, because we want to provide that confidence. And so why Sweden? Once we started looking at where in Europe we should do forestry-based projects, it's really the northeastern side. That's where we have more empty land, more potential, more existing forests as well. And there's less competition for each square of land. So you're not really competing on things like building houses for people. So Sweden is one of them, but we're also in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
You mentioned this idea of a lack of trust. How are you going about addressing that problem?
One of the key things we've done is actually built this database, and we call it a digital twin of forests. And basically what that means is in the countries where we're at, we always build it country by country. We draw data from a lot of different sources, things like satellite data, LiDAR data, whatever government records are available about forests. And we combine it all together to identify where is land that could be converted into forests, or where are there existing forests that are currently planned to be cut down, but maybe should be maintained as forest and kind of managed via impact forestry instead. So this digital tool, we have a level of granularity where you can go down to 5 by 5 meter hexagons. For each of them, we have a ton of data. So we know in this soil, you should be planting pine, for example. In the hexagon next to it, actually, you shouldn't be planting anything because it's organic soil, and organic soil you don't want to be afforesting. So we have this like incredible level of transparency into what we do. And then we are also able to continue monitoring the actions through like remote sensing, those same satellite and LiDAR data, etc. So hopefully that gives you a bit of sense of like the transparency is really what we believe is key to trust, right? So rather than having to take us at our word, buyers can go and we can literally show them, look, here's a plot of land. Here's what the orthophotos are like 5 years ago when it was empty. Now there are saplings growing, and you can see in time how they've grown. And that hopefully takes away the need to just purely take our word for it.
It makes a lot of sense because, we've got these technologies that allow us to have, real-time close to real-time insight into what's actually happening on the ground. So that addresses one of the challenges. I guess the next one, you're working with a company called Tribula. Is that how you...
Yes.
Tribula. So one of my questions is, okay, we've got over this issue of understanding and knowing what's actually happening on the ground. How do you go about valuing that? How are you assessing carbon value?
So carbon, well, two pieces. One is how do we actually measure how much carbon two trees sequester, right? And that is basically a matter of equations, because if you know the tree's biomass, if you know how big and wide the tree is and what the volume is, and you know what species it is, you roughly know what proportion of that biomass is carbon. And then you can convert carbon into CO2 by basically multiplying by 3.64. But the things for estimating carbon based on tree biomass, and then also estimating the tree biomass based on measurements, there are these things called allometric equations for that. But high level, historically how it's done, someone goes out into the forest with a measuring tape, stands in a circle, measures all the trees around them at eye height, counts how many there are, and then applies a bunch of formulas. You can think that that's a pretty analog way of measuring forests. This is why it's exciting that we now have these other technologies that can supplement that, with satellite imagery and particularly LiDAR. You can actually get other estimates of the biomass as well. And those are also not perfect. So you still need to combine that with on-the-ground sampling. But using both of them together, you can get much more accurate. So that's the answer of like, how do we measure how much actually CO2 is there? And then on the value, I realized you actually asked me earlier, how are we thinking about the carbon market size versus the value? And the voluntary carbon market today is worth about 2 billion euros or dollars, roughly the same thing. And that value it's roughly calculated by total number of credits sold per price per credit. And the price per credit really varies based on the type of credit there is, right? So historically, a lot of voluntary carbon credits are what's called avoidance credits. So it's things like you pay for someone to have a clean cook stove, and then you calculate how much carbon they would have emitted if they had continued to use their non-clean cooking methods. And then that's valued at some number that's usually less than $10 per ton. All the way on the other end, you have technology-based carbon removal, direct air capture, valued in potentially as much as like 1,000, 2,000 per ton because of how much energy that it goes. But the carbon removed is very permanent, locked away in the ground. And then you have this forest-based carbon that's somewhere in the middle. And it depends, again, where you are, how long you're expecting that forest to keep growing. But in Europe, afforestation, we're looking at upwards of 50 euros per ton of CO2 stored. And so that's how when a landowner comes to us, we basically estimate how much carbon removal their plot can generate, and then apply the pricing to that to give them a rough estimate of how much that is worth.
The big question is, how does it work out for the landowner? Because obviously what you're trying to do is incentivize landowners to keep forest around or to grow new forest. How do you actually go about deciding what to do, cutting trees down and selling them for timber versus carbon revenue?
Yeah, this isn't a binary question. So I wouldn't say we're always trying to incentivize landowners to never cut another tree. That would not be the right answer either. Actually, timber is a great material. It's carbon negative, right? If you use wood to build your house, that carbon stays locked in there, versus if you use steel and concrete, you're actually emitting a ton of carbon. So timber is still really important. What we need to balance is timber that we take out of forests versus what we keep growing. And this is, it really comes down to the features of the individual forest. So if you have, for example, an old growth forest with really high biodiversity value, yes, you could sell it for timber, but it's probably worth more when you keep it growing, just because it has all these like other benefits around it. Conversely,
Can I just interrupt just so that the audience can understand? You talk about these other benefits. So we're talking about ecosystem services and the cleaning of water and the cleaning of air and the maintenance of healthy soil and all that kind of stuff.
Like that's at Arbonics, this is how we think about forests. There's layers of value. The very basic is just timber. How many tons of timber can I get out of it? Then there's how much carbon can I store? Then, and with every layer it gets more complex. There's biodiversity, right? And there's how do you measure different sort of species, etc. The ecosystem services that you mentioned are really interesting because yes, forests can be great water purifiers. They can even moderate climate on a local basis. So because they work as evapotranspirators, they basically work as little like AC units, trees. So they keep the immediate area near them cooler and more moist than other areas, so they can bring down temperatures on a local level and make sure that it's more humid on a local level, which obviously have benefits for humans. And then the social benefits. I'm Estonian. We love to go to the forest to pick mushrooms and berries, just to go hiking. I go hiking in the forest every single weekend with my dog. How do you put a value on that? Very hard, but it is a value. It's a big social value. So there's a lot that goes on with forests, and some of it is kind of possible to translate into market terms and others aren't, and some is somewhere in the middle. Biodiversity is a really interesting question in that I think increasingly we know there should be a value to it. How do you calculate it is a whole different ballgame of a question that no one has really perfectly answered yet.
Yeah. I mean, we'll get into that a little bit later because I'm really interested in the Global Biodiversity Agreement and the rules that have been put in place that are basically saying countries have to put rules in place to protect biodiversity. And there's a huge part of the measurement is going to be part of that. But I wanted to come back to this idea you mentioned of permanency, because that really is the fundamental question around trust and transparency and carbon skepticism. Because I remember in the US, there was I think it was a couple of years ago, one of the reserves for the forest carbon market caught fire. And so all the reserves had gone. So if anything happened to the credits, you know, to the trees that were currently in the credit market, there was nothing to, you know, what do we do? Are these credits durable? And what do we mean by durable if they are?
Yeah, I think the first thing is exactly separating between permanence and durability. Permanence is a binary term. Something either is permanent or is not. And nothing in nature is truly permanent, right? And nature is always changing, and trees are definitely a part of that. They're just part of the carbon cycle, and they grow, they sequester more carbon, and then if you leave them to be, they eventually die and release some of the carbon, or they burn down and they release carbon. So that's part of the natural cycle of trees. So yeah, I like to think about durability and duration here. And I think the key thing to face up to is this. Look, nature-based carbon removal is never going to have the same duration as technology-based carbon removal when we're talking hundreds, if not thousands of years. But my argument is it doesn't need to. We need both. But if we limit ourselves to only carbon removal that works on a 1,000-year timescale, we roughly know all the options are on the table. New technologies are being discovered daily, but it takes decades for them to scale up the technology readiness scale to get to significant volume. And even now we're looking at all of the sort of technology-based carbon capture put together. By 2050, if we're really, really lucky and things go really great, it can scale up to 1 gigaton of removals.
Yeah, that's not a lot.
That's not a lot. In contrast, we currently as a planet are annually emitting somewhere like 50 gigatons of emissions. And we're currently removing 9.98% of that removal is done through nature, not just forests, also oceans, wetlands, soils. So that 1 gigaton by 2050, you know, it's important, but it's not going to move the needle really massively. And if you think about the climate challenge we have in front of us today, The real impact that we need is in the next 30 to 50 years rather than 1,000 years. That doesn't mean the 1,000-year stuff isn't important. Absolutely is, because that actually properly removes carbon from the cycle for a long time. But I think there is a real place also for the shorter duration solutions, because they can get us to the point where the more durable solutions can scale up. Because a lot of the barriers for scaling durable solutions are around things like energy use. It's actually very energy intensive to do direct air capture. And while our energy systems globally still run massively on, parts of it are on fossil fuel, we even cannot begin to scale that up unless we are at the point where we have all of our energy green and then excess energy left over for carbon removal. And we're quite a ways away from that. So what do we do in the short term? That's where I think these shorter duration options come to play. But we need to be very transparent and honest about it. So if we're planting a tree today, on average, we would expect that to store carbon for about 50 years. And that's taking into account that depending on the tree type, and I'm talking based here in Northern Europe, in the temperate climate zone, trees grow slowly and carbon removal takes time, but also then they keep growing for a while. So trees mature often, depending on the species, between 60 to 120 years, where they are commercially mature and ready to be cut. But so the 50-year duration kind of takes into account that some of them will die, some might burn down, there might be lost due to pests. That's a sort of average. But we need to be straightforward and upfront about it. I still think that has a role to play, though, because 50 years is a lot better than 0 years.
No, absolutely. And I think there does seem to be a tendency for people to go, I have the solution. It's the only one that's really good. It's the only one that really works. And the reality is that we're in a situation where we need every single solution that will hit at every
100%.
different time frame in every different way. And actually being clear and transparent about what's possible and what's not is the best way forward for everyone to go, okay, it works for this, it doesn't work for that. That brings me to another question about transparency. To actually go about ensuring traceability and ensuring that overcrediting doesn't happen, because obviously that's been a challenge in some of the earlier projects that, credits were awarded more than once. There were too many credits awarded for the actual value of CO2 within an area of forest. So what do you do?
Yeah. So those are two separate problems, I'd say, have been tackled. So the first problem, which was the same area or project being credited multiple times, that happened a lot, in the sort of 90s, maybe early 2000s. That is very easily solved with technology. So today, our projects are certified by Verra. And then the part of that is they know exactly, like within those 5 by 5 meter hexes specificity, exactly where our projects are. And they are able to double check that. When our auditors go through, they double check that those same hectares of land are not registered in any other carbon project anywhere on any standard in the world. So that's the first thing. Like technologically, you can make it very clear that, using map-based technology, that there's only one project per each hectare of land. Then the second piece is overestimating the credits that come from that same project. And historically, and I'm going to try not to get too technical, but historically, the problem was that credit estimations were done by comparing against the baseline. So the baseline is the assumption of what would have happened otherwise. And this was static. So before the project was started, you would basically in Excel calculate what you think the no project scenario is, how much carbon removal would happen, and then your scenario would be compared to that. So in the case of afforestation, the no project scenario is that this land just stays as empty farmland or whatever it may be currently, and therefore sequesters little to no carbon. There's actually been a big movement forward in carbon credit methodologies. And so the new methodology that we use for afforestation uses something called a dynamic baseline. So rather than just once, doing this Excel calculation, making the argument it's 0 carbon removal here and, 100 here, and therefore we should get 100 credits, we actually use this dynamic baseline. And what that means is we are continuously comparing the lands that we have in project to similar matched plots that are not part of any carbon project. And we're comparing the biomass growth on those two plots, on those two sets of samples. And it's the difference that's the credits that are issued. And as you can imagine, it has pros and cons. The pro is no one can blame us that there's a static baseline. So I think that solves the problem of this baselines being artificially too low. What makes life harder, maybe for the landowner and the project developer, is that you can't really predict how many credits are going to come. Because if for whatever reason, in the region where you're doing your project, there is a sudden burst of people planting first for other reason, you lose additionality and you lose credits. And it makes it hard to financially plan out projects. But I do think it gives the buyer the confidence that not only are they, because these projects last for tens and tens of years, our minimum length is 40 years. So If you were still using a number that's 40 years old, you'd probably be quite worried. But the buyer now has the confidence that this baseline is like dynamically recalculated all the time. So I think that solves that second problem of overcrediting.
I mean, I do think this idea of the dynamic baseline is potentially incredibly useful because obviously to an outsider, to a non-specialist, you look at the idea that there's a counterfactual. You know, how do you ever prove that? You said, well, we've got all these credits because we kept a forest here. Okay, but who said that you were going to cut it all down in the first place? Yeah. So I get that really, really helps the buyer and brings a degree of credibility to the concept of forest carbon that's, you know, far stronger than perhaps it has been historically. But you mentioned how challenging that is for the landowner, because if you can't actually quantify the number of credits that you're going to be able to issue in 10 years' time, how do you do it?
Yeah. So I think this is a good example of, this is still a market in transition. This is a market trying to find the right answers. The dynamic baseline is a response to these bad experiences that people have had with static baselines in really large-scale projects and large-scale overcrediting. Famously, there was this Guardian headline a while ago that was like 95% of projects are overcrediting. And that's all newspaper headlines were actually based on a very small sample of projects. And it was highlighting a real problem, but not a problem that's quite as widespread as the headline would suggest, but very much a real problem. The market was facing this real danger of, you know, being mistrusted. And then in many ways, the pendulum swung the other way, which is this dynamic baseline. And you're absolutely right, it causes issues for the landowner and for the project developer, because the landowner is investing in planting trees. We're investing a lot in this upfront eligibility analysis, all the technological pieces we do on the verification monitoring. I think at the heart of this challenge is we haven't fully come to grips with how to think about additionality, because there's a weird thing to additionality, which is the more good behavior happens, the lower your additionality is. And when you think about that logic that way, you're like, right.
Well, I remember this, sorry to interrupt, but it's to me, it's an absolutely key question about this, because I remember when additionality was the big debate around renewable energy projects.
Mm-hmm.
And then countries were going, we need renewable energy targets. And as soon as a country puts in place a policy saying they're targeting 20% renewable energy by 2030, your renewable energy project's no longer additional, because it has to happen outside what would happen on the day-to-day. So I think you bring up an incredibly important point for many, many different areas of the markets, which is, what does additionality actually mean? How are we defining it? And how do we stop taking away the benefit when global norms change? Because what we want is for as much of this stuff to happen as possible. But then if we're not strict on additionality, you then get accusations of not being credible. You know, yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think it's incredibly important. I think we get round it.
I'm not even sure there is a simple answer, but a really good perspective on this that I was reading the other day was from a guy who founded a soil carbon company a while ago and then ended up wrapping it up. And the point he was making is actually additionality as a concept came into being when we were dealing primarily in avoidance credits, right? And so this is the idea of, like, I pay this person to change their behavior. I need to really know that my payment changed their behavior, that they weren't going to change anyway. So that's where additionality is absolutely key, because there's nothing else there. It's just avoided emissions. And his case that he makes is actually, when it comes to carbon removal, maybe we should be thinking about it slightly differently, because the ways of carbon removal that actually are most beneficial for the world in some ways also have co-benefits. And let me explain what I mean by it. So you could do technology-based carbon removal, and basically all you're doing there is you're putting a lot of capital, a lot of money, a lot of energy, and the outcome is you're just taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? And that's it. If you do, let's say, regenerative agriculture, which increases carbon removal into the soil, you also have other benefits, like maybe yields change. The farmers have different labor needs, so in some parts of the world, it might be actually cheaper for them. But those same co-benefits make it less additional. But in the grander scheme of world, like, what do we think is more valuable? Regenerative agriculture, or just piping a bunch of resources directly into only carbon removal?
So maybe we need some kind of sliding scale, which has additionality on one side, induced economic benefits, social and environmental benefits on another side, and you kind of shift on that pendulum and ascribe value in that. Yeah, if I knew how to do that. It would be the world would be a very different place, but it's definitely a very interesting idea.
And I think what's interesting is that thinking is now starting to happen, right? And that dynamic baseline, as I said, was a response to market trends. But I think, again, this trend of how that can in some ways maybe even counteract, like reduce the number of projects that get set up because of the uncertainty, will then drive a need to like, okay, how is that applied? Is it 100%, or is there some sort of proportion that we apply based on how many other net benefits there are to this activity? So I think this is a really interesting theory. I think this could be an interesting PhD project for a couple of like economists combined with agronomists or something like that. But I do think the thinking is moving, and I'm expecting this to continue evolving.
Yeah, and obviously, one of the issues that always comes up with forest carbon credits is this concern about greenwash. But if you actually have complete transparency and some kind of sliding scale which people can point to and say, we're doing it for these reasons, that could actually address it. How do we make sure that what you're doing doesn't become another greenwashing tool?
Yeah, and this is where exactly like where we go to the technology and traceability, and they say, look, we're not trying to just make claims. We can literally zoom in on like Google Maps and show you where this project is, and then we can show you the change that has happened over time. And I think that helps remove some of the just pure claims around it. So the traceability, at least my hope is that definitely helps remove the risk of greenwashing. But I mean, when you talk to corporate carbon credit buyers and sustainability leads, their biggest fear is that they invest in something that then gets called out. And I totally get it. Nobody wants to end up on the front page of the Financial Times with like invested in greenwashing project blah. I do think there's something a little bit sad about this, because look, on the total pool of companies in the world, a very small handful of them are investing in any sort of climate mitigation, right? And they get absolutely beaten up if they're less than perfect. Versus if you're a company that does nothing and doesn't talk about it, no one's calling you out. You're just chilling. And I think that's something really unfair. In a way, we're punishing the people who are trying. And I get why, right? Because we want to avoid the moral hazard of corporations sort of buying their way out of their emissions. But I do think sometimes unintentionally it ends up punishing the ones who are trying to do more forward-thinking stuff, because there's almost no space for them to take risks. And as for how to solve that, I kind of like this idea of, we move away from a pure offsetting and we talk more about contribution. And that would allow corporations to take more chances and say, hey, like, maybe we did some offsetting for which we use purely technology-based carbon removal, and then some nature-based. But we a lot of the nature-based, what we're doing is also we're trying to contribute to these goals on a local level, on a community level. I'm Microsoft. I have a giant data center in Sweden. Let me work with Swedish forest owners to not just grow more forest, but also make sure it's more biodiverse. And some of that I can't translate into how it offsets my data center precisely, but I'm contributing. And I would love to see us move to that, because I think it would remove some of this. I'm so afraid of getting called out for doing something wrong that I'd rather do nothing, which I think is a dangerous, thought pattern for us to go down if we want corporations to actually take responsibility.
Well, there's a famous phrase in English, which is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Exactly.
Because there is, as you say, this expectation that companies are supposed to be better. Microsoft is a really interesting example, because it was one of the tech companies sort of leading the way in offsetting. Then with the growth of AI and data centers, instead of continuing on its path to cut emissions, it increased emissions by roughly a third. So it can be attacked for that. I'm really interested in your view on, for example, Microsoft's CDR strategy, and how does it work in line with the nature-based solutions we've been talking about? Are they doing a bit of everything?
Microsoft's a really interesting case study, because they truly are doing everything, and they're really at the forefront of this. So they were a massive driver behind the Frontier Coalition, which was an advanced market commitment for direct air capture. And now they're driving the Symbiosis Coalition, which is trying to do the same for nature-based, specifically afforestation markets. So advanced market commitment for a large amount of afforestation carbon credits. And I think what's really interesting about Microsoft is, so they're very serious about this. They have a very serious both in-house due diligence team, and they work with some of the best scientific minds on it. They've also taken some risks. They've invested in new types of carbon removal, and it doesn't always work out. There's a case of a company called Running Tide that was trying to sink wooden pellets to the bottom of the ocean around Iceland to grow kelp on it. And for various reasons, actually, it ended up not working. And you could look at it and you could say, like, oh no, like Microsoft, they messed up. But I see this as they supported this company who was able to do a lot of scientific research. It didn't work out, but that's still net value for the world, right? We now know that option
that's
doesn't
the
work.
thing about science. Even if things
Exactly.
don't work out, you learn things from them not working out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I would love to see more companies have that courage. I think the reason Microsoft's been able to do it is they're in a favorable position, even in terms of their actual footprint. If you compare their, margins versus their footprint, their margins are pretty good and their footprint is relatively small. Compare that to someone who, I don't know, manufactures things out of steel with a very thin margin and a very large footprint. They would never be able to take such risks, and they wouldn't be able to invest in this really high price, unproven, but potentially high quality carbon removal. So what Microsoft is doing is a great example, but not many companies can follow in their footsteps. But this is where I think, buyers coalitions like Symbiosis, like Frontier make a lot of sense, because they can spread some of the hard work of due diligence. They can also, on the flip side, create confidence for project developers if they do it sector by sector. And they can also, if everyone's in agreement, look, this is exploratory. We don't know exactly how it's going to work. We're not going to make a claim that every ton that's promised I'm immediately using to offset something and, using as an excuse to just burn fossil fuels on the back end. I think another thing that Microsoft does really well is they sort of they're trying to build a world where they support a lot more carbon removal than their actual footprint. And it's hard for them, especially now with AI. They're having to step up efforts again, but that's what they're trying to do. And they're trying to create that buffer that if some of that doesn't work out, there's other things that will work. So we need more thinking like that. And I think one way could be potentially more corporate buyers coalitions where they sort of join in and spread the risk a little bit.
Yeah.
No one company is putting their brand on the line, but as a whole, they're building the market.
So then one of the things I think I would love to know more about is your vision for the future. I saw that Arbonics has a goal to cover 50% of Europe's forest. What does success look like to you? Where do you want to be in 2030 and 2035? And what do you need to get there?
Fundamentally, the core of what we're trying to build is this idea that every hectare of land lives up to its ultimate potential. And that means that we analyze it through our system. And if it should be forest, we say, we should afforest it. If it's actually best used as farmland, let's keep it as farmland. And in some cases, it's neither. Maybe it's actually very close to a city and should be used for housing, right? We also don't want forests to push out people and increase an already burning housing problem in some countries. So ultimately, our goal is that anywhere in Europe, you could just put in land details and we could tell you in our system what's the biggest potential for this land from a carbon and also all these other elements. That's obviously, there's a ways to go to that. Today we can do that from an afforestation perspective and from an existing forest perspective. And we can also filter out land that we know is definitely not good for forestry at all. But we want to build on that. We want to build in an element of valuing the biodiversity into that. And we want to scale it to every country. And there's a really interesting challenge. 3 years ago, when we were setting up the company, we were choosing between two paths. Path one was cover all of Europe immediately using like high-level satellite data, etc. Accuracy would be maybe 70%. Or go country by country, much slower, much more painstaking, but you can get to a much higher level of accuracy because you're using local data. That's the path we went down. It means expanding is every country, we're basically building the platform from scratch. So it's harder work, but we do think more accurate. Yeah, building up to cover 50% of Europe's forests, as we've said, that requires adding quite a few more countries like that, piece by piece.
I'm really interested in the approach because one of the things that's fascinating about the carbon markets is this idea that it doesn't matter where CO2 is emitted, it affects the global climate as a whole, but that action has to be local. And then if you're talking about the development of international treaties like the Global Biodiversity Framework, which sits alongside the Paris Agreement, you've got to find ways of doing things at a hyper-local level because biodiversity is literally a local issue. It's not about the point source, it's about what's going on the ground. So I think there's some really interesting potential for how those things can come together. I know we're early days with the Global Biodiversity Framework and there's lots of pushback and discussion and all sorts of different things going on, but it's a fascinating area. And actually having access to that level of granular data, I suppose in many ways puts you a step in front of others in terms of addressing new forms of regulation when they come in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, one of my questions is always at the very end of an interview, what haven't I asked you that you think I should have?
Oh, good question. I think we've covered a lot. Maybe something more on the regulatory side. Yeah, we could spend a whole other
that would be
45 minutes on that. Hours,
I think
really.
one of the things I'm thinking of doing is putting together a kind of panel on regulation and actually having a discussion with everything that's going on in Europe. So if you'd be interested in taking part and coming back to do that, that would be great.
Yeah, I'd love to. We're one of those
Excellent.
rare startups where we actually think more regulation is a good thing. You never really hear that from startups.
No, that's very true. But mostly because this is, I think, one of the challenges with the idea of the markets is the concept of the market is a free market, but carbon is a market created by regulation. So you have to have clarity about what's going on. You have to have frameworks and solid frameworks that can be consistent and durable in the same way we want our credits to be durable. We need our policies to be durable as well. And that is turning into a bit of a challenge for everybody. Okay, to our listeners, I hope you learned some interesting things. I'm going to add some details about Arbonics and Tribula to the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really, really appreciated your insight, and I wish you all the best of luck with Arbonics.
Thank you for having me.